You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. And I'm joined by my illustrious co-host to start off with, Mr. Ciaran O'Connor. Ciaran, you and I are back on the mic, buddy. I feel like it's been a minute. How you doing?
Yeah, man, it has been a minute. It feels good. It feels like order has been restored to the universe.
That's right. Yeah, man. And for folks watching on YouTube, you'll get to see Ciaran is thoroughly relaxed at the moment. I kind of like the collar sort of up around the neck a little bit. Got that relaxed
That's right.
going on. Yeah, in a new apartment. Is that right?
New apartment. I also got some natural highlights in my hair, I should point out.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's some changes going on here. Okay, cool.
Why not?
That's right. Well, enough banter, man. We're joined by some of our favorite people here. These folks who are joining us today are all all-stars in the movement to depolarize America, or whatever we might end up referring to it as. But each of these folks are people who are honestly pioneers in the area of building bridges across differences in our social and political life in America. Each of these folks has contributed mightily. We are joined by Miss Liz Joyner, founder of the Village Square. Say hello, Liz.
It's a pleasure to be with everyone today.
Absolutely. We are joined by Miss Debilyn Molineaux, founder of the Bridge Alliance. How you doing, Debilyn?
I am doing great today, and it's good to have the band back together.
There you go. We're getting ready to gear up and go on tour, but we can't do that without Pearce Godwin singing the lead. Pearce, founder of Listen First and National Conversations Project. How are you doing today, Pearce?
Very well, brother. So good to be with the most inspiring people I know in this space.
Absolutely, man. Well, I feel good about the fact that we are all here on the microphone. Took us too long to finally do this, but on the other hand, this will be the first conversation of many among the group of us and among the wider roster of people who are pushing for a more unified and depolarized America. So it's great to be here with you guys. So everyone, okay, we are here. It is early August 2020. And I think that a year ago, 2 years ago, 4 years ago, we all knew that the 2020 election was going to be something that was, we all knew that it would be a wild ride in terms of the divisions that were likely going to beset the country. That's a big part of what's inspired all of our organizations to be in this line of work to begin with. And yet, things have happened that none of us, I think, could possibly have expected. In a way, the election itself is almost the least the least part of what we talk about day to day, because the country has shifted in so many different respects. What I want to do just to start off with is go around the table, hear a little bit from each of you for anybody in our audience who isn't familiar about the work of your organizations and how you generally are sort of engaging the moment that we are in. Starting with Debilyn. Debilyn, what's going on with the Bridge Alliance? Tell us about it, and how are you dealing with 2020?
Right. Well, Bridge Alliance, I'll start there. Bridge Alliance is a networked organization of 100 different groups that are strengthening democracy. And the Bridging Divides segment of our members do a lot of really great work in that cultural shift, if you will, or civic engagement outreach. We have two other big sectors of work: campaign and elections reform, policy making, and governance as well. And we're working to help all of these sectors, all of this great work being done, help lead us to healthy self-governance, which we think has never been part of our nation yet, but it will be.
Okay. And are there ways in which how has the lockdown affected the work of the organizations within the Bridge Alliance Coalition and perhaps your own day-to-day labors? How's the overall kind of change in American life impacted?
Yeah, interestingly enough, Bridge Alliance has always been, we've always had a virtual office. So for us, how we work hasn't changed on a day-to-day basis. What we have seen across the field, and I'll loosely call it the democracy field right now, what we've seen across the field is that a lot of folks, shifted from in-office to home office work. And instead of us sitting down and taking a break and taking stock of where we are, the work has actually accelerated. And so as the lockdowns happened and as people were under stay-at-home orders and there's the stress and people are trying to school from home, et cetera, we ended up creating a crisis recovery guide because our members were creating so much resource material for the general public and for each other. And so our work has accelerated, and it's only been in the last, I want to say 3 to 4 weeks that we've even seen a slowdown of the quantity of resources being developed.
Interesting.
And then I'll just put a little pin in this because it may or may not come up in our topic. We've been working on a diversity report or diversity project that has resulted in a report that came out last week. And it takes a look at who's in the democracy field and who's not in the democracy field, self-identified, so that we can help the work that we're doing be representative of America as a whole and not just the usual suspects, if you will, that like doing this work.
Gotcha. Yeah, so I think we'll have an opportunity to get into that a little bit too, sort of who the usual suspects are and sort of what collectively we're all trying to do to bring Americans into this space from across the wider spectrum of politics and identity. But Liz, Liz, talk to us a little bit about the Village Square. I will mention the fact that I've been pleased to address the Village Square audience in Tallahassee, Florida in the past.
And we were pleased to have you.
Yes, indeed. And of course, Liz, you are also responsible for the Village Square is responsible for the Respect and Rebellion speaker series, which has sent Ciaran and I touring across the country as, kind of aspiring rock stars in the area of civil dialogue, at least to college campuses and so forth. We've had wonderful experiences with that. So if you want to talk a little bit about that too, that'd be great. But tell us about the work of Village Square and particularly sort of how we're adjusting to the context of COVID-19, the lockdown, and all things 2020.
Well, so if you don't mind me detouring for just a minute, I did want to say a word about the people that I find myself on this podcast with. Sure. And I think it may not be immediately apparent to listeners that you're real heroes. And I've watched the heroic work that you've done over years now and the sacrifices that you've made to just sort of be there on the ground and keep doing this work when it's hard. It's always hard. It's either hard or harder, right? But it's really been a joy to see what you've all built together. And it's just really my honor to be here. The Village Square is devoted. If Debilyn and Pearce are sweeping across the country with their work, we're just zeroed in on community-based work and building communities across divisions. And one of our primary philosophies is that ultimately we've sort of gotten a little, we've lost that community center of gravity that is kind of the ballast for healthy democracy, because that's where you can have naturally cross-cutting relationships. You might agree with people, or disagree with people politically, but then your kids play softball together. You're on the PTA together. And it's those kinds of relationships across differences that really make it possible for a healthy democracy to exist. And so we're focused on that aspect of this work. In the Village Square, we're almost 14 years old now, and we've been doing this for a long time. We host 25 or 30 events a year here in Tallahassee. We also have a location in Fort Lauderdale, and we gather in all sorts of different ways. Interestingly, one of the ways that we gathered probably about 4 or 5 years ago, we started a project called Local Color after the Trayvon Martin tragedy, with the intention of gathering diverse audiences across color more intently. And so that's been a very, it's been an interesting perspective to watch the challenges unfold with, because we've been doing it for such a long time. This is Violet, for those watching. My cat just walked behind me.
Hi, Violet.
And I think that one of it's been both wonderful and challenging, because I think that we've really felt kind of the geography narrow, that there's less and less space that exists for people to be able to be building these bridges, it feels like. And so that feels very challenging. I'm probably the only one on this podcast who's old enough to have watched like Get Smart when it was actually on the air. But like he would find himself in these rooms where the walls would narrow and narrow. Mm-hmm. And it's felt like that to me some, even right here in this hometown, even when we've been doing this for a decade and a half. But I also think that we've also seen just some really amazing things happen where we've been able to build some very, what in all times would be challenging panels after the George Floyd tragedy to really talk about it. And so it's been sort of confirmation of how those relationships that you build create this muscle that you can just keep going back to. And so it's both challenging and promising, I would say. And then as regards to Respect and Rebellion, that is a speaker series that's designed. We originally started on college campuses, but we want to expand into community work as well. And it pairs friends, real life friends like John and Ciaran, who disagree on politics, and brings them onto campus or into your community event as a pair, which, completely changes the dynamics of conversations where there's some dynamics around whether somebody should be on campus in an event. But if you're bringing both opinions there together, it's transformative. And I should also mention that Debilyn and Pearce are also a speaker pair, and they've got a nice friendship story themselves.
Maybe we can hear a little bit about the Pearce and Debilyn friendship story. But Pearce, to start off with here, so we've heard from Liz and Debilyn. With National Conversations Project, first of all, give us an overview of what NCP is, what NCP is doing, and particularly so in the context of COVID-19 and, again, just the state of affairs in 2020.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, John, Lead Listen First Project, National Conversation Project, the mission of those entities, like, really all of us on this call, is to mend America's frayed social fabric by building relationships and bridging divides with those conversations that prioritize understanding, with conversations, as Liz said, across difference, which we're just not having these days. Back in 2013, I thought I'd had a rather original idea when I wrote a little blog post on a bus ride across Africa called It's Time to Listen, troubled by what I was going to be stepping back into, not just in Washington, D.C., where I'd been, but also back home in my backyard in North Carolina. But it quickly became apparent as I was exploring on social media and putting out this, listen first pledge, I'll listen first to understand, that indeed it wasn't an original idea. But even way back in 2013, there were a number of organizations out there doing this work, seeking to bring people together across differences. And as it happens, Liz and Debilyn here are the first two people I spoke with saying, oh my gosh, it's not just little old me in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina. And over time, my own focus, given that, has been not on creating any kind of distinctive widget in the space, but rather curating this Listen First coalition, which started with 4 organizations represented here by Liz and Debilyn in part, and now has over 325, and thinking about how together, working collectively, we can break into the mainstream. How can we aggregate, align, and amplify all the incredible work on the community level, as Liz spoke about, on the national level that Debilyn looks at a lot. How can we, with our powers combined, actually shift culture, actually reach farther and impact greater than any one organization could alone? One of the ways we've done that over the last few years, having built back in late 2017, this kind of overarching conversation, platform, a National Conversation Project, is to have these annual National Weeks of Conversation. We thought the third National Week of Conversation would be April 17 through 25 of this year. But of course, the world turned upside down, and it didn't seem terribly prudent to encourage people back in April to come together with in-person conversations. So, the field collectively said, okay, this was going to be our big, kind of collective effort, as we've done in years past, to some real impact. What are we going to do? Not only what is this going to mean for the National Week of Conversation, but how is this health crisis, increasingly economic crisis, but rapidly apparent social crisis and isolation crisis, how can we, in our capacities and in the expertise across this field, serve and meet this moment in serving our neighbors and nation. So with a big old call with 60 plus field leaders in early March, we said, all right, National Week of Conversation, not a great idea, but let's do something. We've got to respond. And that became the Weaving Community Campaign, with the focus on recognizing that America is divided and broken, but that we can make it stronger by building relationships starting where we live. So what we're trying to do with now over 100 organizations really actively promoting this campaign, including all represented on this call, and so grateful for Braver Angels and others, is to inspire millions of Americans of all stripes to start or deepen those relationships in their communities. And so that's where, you know, my focus and the focus of all of the organizations involved working collectively has been is leading the Weaving Community Campaign at weaving.us to reach farther and impact greater, as I said, you know, in this moment of desperate need and compounding crises.
And so the Weaving Community Campaign is something that National Conversations Project is involved with in collaboration with the Weave the Social Fabric Project, which is founded by David Brooks and originally co-founded by our colleague at Braver Angels, Miss April Lawson, who listeners to the fans of the podcast will be well familiar with. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, I mean, it's been wonderful to have David and his voice and Weave, and them reminding all of us that, you know, it leads with relationships. That David has a line that in his view, you know, the culture is upstream from the market in the state. So some of us, I know I come from a political background. John, I know you do. Ciaran, you know, Debulyn's run for office. Many of us have kind of lived in that political space. But it's always a good reminder that it's the human level first, and it's about how we can strengthen those relationships and see humanity in one another. And that's when we'll see the political space and all other of our arenas really transformed.
That's right. So Ciaran, what's on your mind about this conversation here?
Yeah, so Pearce, you just mentioned the human element, and I've heard all of you in some way sort of reflect on the importance of face-to-face work. You know, it's hard to hate up close. You have to look someone in the eye. You have to see their body language, you know. Obviously, so much of that work is impossible right now. And while there are, you know, certain advantages and opportunities to bringing work online, you know, you can reach a lot more people. You can do some interesting geographical bridging work, you know, where you get a community in an affluent Boston suburb together with a community in a rural Louisiana parish. Just get them together on Zoom. At the same time, it really is difficult oftentimes to recreate that level of intimacy and sort of build that relational foundation upon which you can seek to greater accomplish the goals that we all share. So this is something that we've been working on at Braver Angels, bringing everything online and sort of navigating this. And I'm just curious to hear from you guys on how you guys have been engaging that challenge. I know, Debilyn, you mentioned that a lot of your internal work was virtual before. That's the same with us for the most part in Braver Angels. We're sort of spread around the country. But in terms of the actual work on the ground and the conversations, how do you guys think about this challenge, you know, as we move forward in an environment in which it's not clear, you know, when we might be able to regularly gather again in person, particularly for people with health conditions and all of that. So yeah, just throwing that out there because I think it's something we've all been thinking about.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to add here, you know, in this Debilyn, for those on the podcast, virtual connecting is a different skill set than in-person connecting. It's not that it's better or worse, but it is different. And I hearken back to like, I trained as a life coach about 20 years ago. And one of the things that in building my coaching practice, I learned how to listen on the phone, because video conferencing wasn't a thing yet, in such a way that I could hear the smallest differences in people's voice and know to go after it, because I had the skills to do that. And so transferring it on to video conferencing now, that has just made that element or that skill set all the easier. And then the other skill set of in-person, when we eventually get back to in-person, is another layer of communication, if you will, but it's a different subset of how to listen. So I'll throw that into the mix. And Liz, I know you've got a lot of things to say about this.
I'm not sure how wise they are, but honestly, my first reaction was probably what a lot of bridge builders thought, given that our whole model is based on human to human relationships and contact. It was like, what do we do? And it may be a really long time before we can go back to how we do things. I think that the way that we've been thinking about it is that we are we're still focusing on the same relationships. They're just digital, and we're still thinking bottom up. And I think we're starting to recognize sort of some of the advantages involved in, as you say, Ciaran, the lack of geographic boundaries that we normally have. So we've gotten kind of excited about some of the programming that we can have over the next year that just really wouldn't be a possibility otherwise. But we're still using it to build community. So we're still very much specifically thinking, how do we get these people in this community more engaged with each other around the issues that are in front of us. So, we're hoping that we'll actually come out of it stronger for having gone through it. But it is most definitely not, our first choice about how we do business. And the other thing is that you're probably all going to be getting calls soon enough about being on our podcast, or being in one of our community events. So, so we're excited about that part of it.
Happy to return the favor. Absolutely. Pearce, did you want to jump in on the subject?
Yeah, Ciaran, you mentioned, the benefit of scale. Debilyn mentioned that it's a different skill set, and it's also just, inherently involves trade-offs. And me, personally, I would always prefer to, hang out with you people in person. But as you mentioned, Ciaran, allows you to bridge that additional dimension of geography and indeed reach more people. So certainly the Weaving Community Campaign is amplifying and promoting the virtual events that Braver Angels is doing, and many other partners. I think the other thing, we're trying to really lean into right now is scaling the way in which all of us, preferably not those of us on this call who are leading organizations, but can kind of model the type authenticity, whether it's on social media or via text message, that we think will lead to that relationship building. So, we've got, this idea of getting real on social. How are you feeling right now? And providing folks graphics. It's not a conversation per se in the traditional sense, but if, my network on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, what have you, TikTok, sees me not doing what Sam Cherry on our team calls the human highlight reel, but actually getting gritty and saying, you know what, I'm frustrated. You know what, I'm depressed. I'm sad. I'm hopeful. I'm excited. I'm confused. I'm scared. That kind of authenticity, which we can broadcast to the world, might engender the kind of sharing, the kind of real human vulnerability that would be fertile ground for that relationship building.
I also would throw in the idea that when you think about it, it hasn't been that long that we've been having to navigate digital social media relationships in our civic space. And so in the same way that we sort of learned over time that they weren't necessarily the healthiest way to maintain constructive democracy, and we were learning how to do it different ways. In some ways, maybe there's some opportunities in sort of looping back around again, right? And saying, well, how can we make this space? We know now that this space doesn't necessarily run very healthy. How can we loop back around and make it healthier? So I think there's some opportunities when everything gets all jumbled up and thrown up in the air. And I think there's some opportunities here.
Yeah, well, it's not as if the digital sort of playground, so to speak, is going to disappear. I mean, it was always going to be a major part of how we were going to have to engage each other. So maybe this is catalyzing some real creativity in our space in terms of how we go about taking advantage of that, because it is a core civic issue. How can we strengthen our sort of the heart of our civil society and our civic culture in a landscape that's fraught with communication challenges, right? And sort of barriers to empathy. And, I think at Braver Angels anyway, we certainly have felt that, initially, Ciaran will tell you, the idea of having to do everything online when we had planned to do so much on the ground. We had a national bus tour that we were gearing up for. We were going to bring each of you guys on the bus and, hang out and have you guys join the tour at different stops.
It was right ahead of your conference too.
Yeah, that's right. We had a national convention that wound up being scrapped. I think maybe you guys did too, Pearce and Debilyn. I can't recall, but yeah, so we had to adjust. But in adjusting, we've witnessed all sorts of new opportunities to really, bring people in from across a wider landscape. It feels sometimes like you lose some of the intimacy, but when the reach grows, there's certainly something to be said for that. And by being creative and compelling with the programming, I feel like we've been pretty effective. I'm sorry, Ciaran, I think you had another question for folks.
I do. I have two other questions, and they sort of mirror each other in an interesting way. The first is about the challenge of recruiting conservatives, something that we've definitely found at Braver Angels, and we've been sort of laser focused on from the beginning. We have the Braver Angels rule, which is that every level of leadership in our organization, from staff to board of directors to funding to participants in red blue workshops, we want to be as rigidly 50-50 as we can. And yet when it comes to overall general membership, it skews pretty heavily blue. We do have a fair cadre of conservative leaders and thousands of conservative members, but it really does skew blue. It also skews, in our case, older, whiter, better educated. These are all things we're working on. And again, I think the digital targeting and digital opportunities actually provide some exciting opportunities to do this. In July, we just, as part of our first month of the 2020 campaign, we focused on race in America, and with a concerted effort on attracting communities of color and folks in the social justice community. And in September, the theme is going to be Trump's America. And we're going to be working to engage and recruit as many Trump supporters and Trump sympathetic leaders as we can, because obviously we see that as so crucial to the work. So I'm sure you guys have faced that same challenge. And I'd just be curious to hear you guys speak about how that's gone for you, how it's going, and how you hope it to go.
I'm personally deeply passionate about this because I am a conservative, and it is an absolutely, systemic challenge in this field. There are a lot of reasons, for it. I tried to pull together the best wisdom out there. 86% of it is from Liz Joyner, and the other part is from David Blankenhorn of Braver Angels. But into this 15-page, field playbook on engaging conservatives, and so we're trying to tackle that. I'm not going to share too much of it. You can get it straight from the horse's mouth from Liz and Debilyn. But the thing that I always remind myself and remind my dear friends who may not be conservative or in my case, having a Republican background, is that just to be very explicit about it, we don't mend the frayed fabric of America with the 60% who currently don't approve of the president. It's just not how math works. And so whatever we think, whatever, indignation we may hold, if we're serious about this work, if we are serious about building relationships across differences, about having a culture across the spectrum, Americans of all stripes, that is listening first to understand, that is, maximizing diversity, is leading with grace and suspending judgment, then there's not an option. And we've all been so inspired by what Braver Angels has done to not just kind of try, but absolutely mandate in your principles that that's going to be the case. But I know, that doesn't prevent, that endemic challenge of conservatives like myself just not being quite as naturally excited about this work. So I'll just echo what you said, Ciaran, that it's absolutely mission critical for us to do that. I think we've seen some success. Certainly Braver Angels has modeled a lot of that success. Liz has been so tremendously intentional. I want her to speak about that herself, but it remains a challenge, but it's one that literally in spending more money with Facebook ad credits to get more conservatives, to get people from rural areas, to get people who aren't white, engaged in the current campaign is what we're doing, because it's harder and there's real practical implications of that. You have to work harder through relationships and work harder even in, you know, the advertising space to draw in and fill those gaps.
Yeah, and so I mean, there's a similar difficulty that comes to bear sometimes when it comes time to reach out across the color line, and that puts us squarely in the context of our, you know, the racial dynamics of the present moment in American life. I think that there's a lot of folks who are passionate in their advocacy for social justice, say, certainly folks from communities of color who, in many cases at least, not at all cases, but in many cases, feel that it is sort of an added burden to come into conversations where they have to maintain dialogue with folks whose politics they feel are, you know, sort of threatening to the type of progress that they're trying to make in a way that can feel maybe dehumanizing and an almost sort of just a cultural, experiential sort of level. And that becomes very intricate conversational dynamic to sort of manage. And so, Debilyn, I'm wondering what your take is on that aspect of the outreach, reaching into communities of color, bringing in progressives and so forth, of that stripe.
Thought you were going to go to Liz next.
Liz,
yeah. So I think what I wanted to add here, and I'll come back to what you were asking, John, is that whoever perceives themselves to be in power are the least likely to come to have a conversation with people who are asking for a change in the power dynamics. And so when I first got into this bridge building work, or transpartisan work, we even called it back in the day, the progressives were not interested in coming. They had Clinton in office. It was just like, why should we come and talk to you? We have what we want. And so thinking about it also in those terms, and then the other systemic piece to think about is the tipping point. So we're trying to take a different, like, debate has been the foundation of our country since inception, hard debate. And the approach that we are all advocating for is dialogue or deliberation. So trying to use a different process other than debate, which can be very divisive. Even in our founding, the debate part of it was very divisive. And so we're trying to mainstream a new way of doing policymaking and community building. And in that respect, this is Bobo joining me on camera, by the way. In that,
got a lot of cats on the call today.
Cool cats, that is, cool cats. But if you think about Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, anytime you're trying to get a new idea out into the community, you start with the innovators, you go to the early adopters, you hit mainstream, and then you have a series of late adopters. So right now, the folks who are trying new things tend to be folks who see the world as an opportunity, and that generally, unfortunately, tends to be people who are experimental, and therefore they're like more progressive in politics. And I think the brain science has borne this out. So part of the overall systemic question that I have for us to think about and maybe talk about a little bit is, what makes it worth it? How do we become that American family where we're not going to give up on each other because we're worth it when we're together? And so I'm going to just pause there.
Okay. Liz, why don't you go ahead and pick up where Debilyn left off, and if you want to say anything about the point about bringing in people of color, that'd be fine too.
I can't believe you and I have never talked tipping point. That was actually one of the foundational things we were thinking when we started the Village Square all these years. So we have to do that sometime. Really profound and important. So in terms of our experience, I regularly tell people that one would think that the hardest part of navigating this very deep divide is when you get liberals and conservatives together. How can they ever be nice to each other? That's actually easy. The hard part is getting them in the room. And that goes also to to diversity and color as well. The hard part is getting a diverse group of people in the room together. Once you do that, really, whether it's a digital room or a real room, it's actually pretty easy. The kind of the reciprocal nature of human beings takes over, and you've got a tailwind instead of a headwind. We humans are actually pretty cool that way. And the problem is that we're living in an environment that has made it so easy to be siloed with people just like us. And that's also a human need, and it's a human tendency. And so, in a lot of ways, that I guess Robert Putnam calls it social capital bridging and bonding. And so social media has made bonding social capital extremely easy. And if we want to make our democracy healthy again, we have to find ways to make the bridging capital easier. In terms of bringing conservatives in, and my politics lean left, and so I really have learned an extraordinary amount from conservatives over the years, and I have so many treasured relationships that I've learned from. So it's true, there really is no shortcut. You have to make sure that those relationships are there, because that's the walk we have to be walking. And I've come to understand that I think that for conservatives, often conservatives may have a little less faith, or place a little less faith in kind of the public square as a central part of their lives. So they would turn more often to their faith communities, to families, and in some ways the way that we're really wrestling with 50 or 60 years of divisions, and liberals have just been more operational out in the public square. So it tends to be sort of how they exercise their civics more often. And then I think compounding that, one of the things that we've seen over the years, it's been actually really surprising, but it's a pretty consistent pattern, which is that when we get diverse groups of the people in the room together, conservatives are much more tolerant of the attitudes of liberals and vice versa. And most of the difficulty we've had with intolerance have been actually that. And I don't think that it's intentional. I think it's kind of a blind spot. And maybe, because liberals aren't spending quite enough time with conservatives. I could do a deep dive with some of John Haidt's theories that we really think are really applicable here. But, for us, one of the key things has been to be very intentional about making sure that conservatives are very welcome when they show up for our conversations. And sometimes that means, Tallahassee is like a kind of a 60-40 community, leaning more liberal. And so we're always going to have fewer conservatives in the audience, but I really am almost always thinking of how what we're doing will feel to a conservative who comes in, and to that end we're very intentional about keeping we have like rules of the road for our local color conversation. That include rules that, just say, hey, we can say things in the wrong way. And we're still here. We're being intentional. We're being respectful towards each other. And actually in some ways that local color process has been one of the most enlightening parts of our work lately, because we started the race related work after we, were doing the partisan divide. And so that meant that we were having conversations on race, being very intentional about keeping conservatives engaged in that conversation. And, just to share with people who are involved in this work, the most transcendent things have come out of that intentionality, of just making certain that conservatives felt very welcome and that they could say what they needed to say. The most touching moments, the things that stay with us forever, come from that. And so, in some ways, this is it's tragic that we're not doing this more often, because it changes everything.
Well, a couple things you guys said really resonated with me, and I think that was a really incisive way of putting it. The first was just in thinking about sort of the ideological grounding of the two sides, which I think you guys all spoke about. It's been interesting because I think it's gotten pretty scrambled in the past 4 years, with President Trump or Trumpism, and the binary that confronts Americans, particularly on the right, who they know they're not liberal. They never wanted to vote for Hillary Clinton. And so their sort of option is a president who, is advocating for conservative values in some ways, but in many important ways is not. If you think about certain values, in my view, humility, fidelity, small L liberal values. And so that's something that I think has been interesting in just sort of thinking about how people make decisions. And you mentioned Jonathan Haidt, and he's obviously spoken a lot about how the cultural, the tribal, the emotional are what really drive people, not so much the rational. So I think that's something to keep in mind for all of us as we're working to reach out to conservatives is meeting them where they are. And that leads me to my second point that I heard was this sort of discussion about dialogue, deliberation, or debate. Because at Braver Angels, we've been leaning very heavily into debate. Our flagship program right now is Braver Angels Debates. We make clear that it's not the kind of debate that you're going to see on social media or you're going to see at a political rally or a college debate. Nobody wins, for example. The goal is not to vanquish or humiliate your foe. The goal is to speak your mind fully without fear, with vigor, but not in bad faith. And we found it to be really successful, particularly in attracting conservatives who might be a little bit more resistant to discussions framed as dialogue that they may see as sort of veiled attempts to enlighten them, right? So whereas debates, it's like, here's an opportunity to make your voice heard on a level playing field. And that's what we're really trying to do with this kind of fight right campaign, is recognize that we are in an election season. It's natural to compete and to do so with passion, and to argue and to not, paper over disagreements, but there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. And on September 3rd, we're actually going to be hosting one of our first webinar debates, which means there's capacity of up to 10,000 people. And the participants will be debating the question of, should we reelect Donald Trump? So cutting to the heart, of the divide. And so far, and John can maybe say a little bit more about this, we've really tried to lean into conflict and see conflict as a pathway to intimacy and connection, versus something to be avoided or, something to be driven around. So that's one thing I think about a lot. John, what do you think about, what everyone just said in the context of recruiting conservatives and how it speaks to the larger issue of meeting people where they are with respect and compassion and empathy, but also courage?
Well, so there's a strong dialogue component to Braver Angels work, and increasingly there's, as you said, Ciaran, sort of an approach to debate which is modified to emphasize the sort of communal pursuit of truth in a spirit of humility. So you don't leave your passion at the door. You bring in the rigor. But where it differs from the type of debate, Debilyn, that I think you were referring to, is that the idea of personally demonizing your opponents in order to push an argument over the political finish line is adamantly not what we do, right? But I think that one tension that I've identified in the work of trying to bring Americans together is that on the one hand, so Ciaran interviewed Ezra Klein on this podcast. And in that podcast, Ezra Klein made the point that, well, intergroup contact methods, workshops, and some of the things that Village Square, Braver Angels, and all of our organizations here do, these are good for soothing relationships between smaller groups of people when you have time to spend together. But that sort of thing doesn't scale out very well because social movements need heat and friction and so forth. I think one of the reasons we've pivoted in this direction is because once it comes down to the living question of a political issue in the moment, it can be hard to pump the brakes long enough to get people to look at each other in that kind of a thoughtful sort of a way when everybody's in a rush to see to it that their side wins. And so there's still this need to manage our political arguments in real time. And so, Pearce, I'm wondering from your vantage point, actually, this is a question for all of you. One of the things that we get hit with a lot is the idea that, look, it's nice that you guys are trying to get folks to get along, but at the end of the day, that's slowing down the work of actually seeing to it that the progressive agenda wins, or seeing to it that Donald Trump is able to successfully beat back the tide of, left-wing radicalism or whatnot in this country. How is it that you guys, whether organizationally or just personally, tend to, because I know you have to get this criticism, how is it that you guys respond to this idea that the work of trying to build these bridges is actually something that stands in the way of social progress or political progress, depending on what side of the aisle you may be coming from?
Yeah. I would prefer, we probably all would prefer that people were entering into this work because, as Debilyn suggested, it's worth it for there to be some sense of unity, common purpose, common humanity, in this place that we call the United States. It's not always the case. So really, I just fall back on a very pragmatic point. And honestly, in a conversation I had with a leading television commentator some years ago, and saying, hey, if nothing else, listening first to understand where you're coming from will help me better counter your argument and defeat your position. And when I said that, this commentator said, that's it. That's what'll get this block of people. And I said, oh man, really? Or do we have to go to that base level of self-serving? But hey, whatever it takes. But in all seriousness, the having these conversations, better understanding not just this amorphous them, this two-headed alien that's out to get you and demonize you, but where are they coming from? What are their values? What are these moral foundations that are driving them? What are their interests? Maybe they are diametrically opposed. I doubt it. There's probably some overlap. So I'm just believe with every fiber of my being that whatever our personal passions and agendas may be, to better understand the opposition is going to help us broaden our coalitions, be more effective in our messaging, and ultimately have a better shot at achieving whatever our ends may be.
That's well said, Pearce. And I would add on that not surprisingly, we completely agree at the Village Square with your characterization at Braver Angels of what you're trying to create, is that sort of dynamic engagement across differences that can be challenging, but that is a critical part of American democracy, and not something that we can or should avoid. And I believe that we've really, in many ways, lost track of our own American idea. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The idea that you could have a government led by people at the time was insane. It wasn't self-evident at all. It had never happened before in human history. And our framers were solid students of human nature, and they bequeathed us this system where we check each other's blind spots, where we push and we pull and we tug, and we come together and we come apart and we come back together again. And out of that comes truth and ideas. And from my perspective, individually, I now see so many of the blind spots that I didn't see when I didn't have relationships with conservatives. And so it's abundantly clear to me now that I would never be able to solve problems in the same way if I didn't have people who saw the world differently than I did. And so I think that instead of seeing each other as the enemy, we need to find a way to sort of come back around to seeing each other as partners in figuring things out. And so sometimes it's uneasy, often it's uneasy. We have a real difference of opinion. But that kind of engagement is everything. And, frankly, I would add that it's the foundational idea of the Enlightenment. It's the foundational idea of American universities. It's how we The legal system works this way, where we put people together and we let them push and pull and strain and decide whether someone is guilty or innocent. And so I feel like we need to elevate that idea again into this new world of digital interactions, so that we remember that what we're doing here together is incredibly important. And to sort of the sidedness of this, I would argue that that in that environment, the best ideas keep rising, and I think they have historically, and I think they will continue to do so. Because they'll be stronger, and so I just have a lot of faith that we need to get back to being able to engage.
Man, y'all are brilliant. I just want to keep going. Ditto, 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 ditto. But I think finding a way to offer dignity to all of us is part of what we're looking for right now, because the people who have not had dignity in their lives are the ones who are really loud right now, whether it's the Trump supporters or Black Lives Matter activists, whatever. What's missing from all of this that could help us become an American family again is dignity, and centering, whether it's our work, centering our work around how do we reveal the dignity in every situation, or the solutions that we come up with, so that we are doing this together, I think is my hope for our future. And I keep bringing in the family metaphor, because we have so many battle and war metaphors out there also in culture, when people get on social media and they have their little comment battle, on Facebook, or tweet battles, et cetera. And really what we need is we need a healthy argument, a healthy debate. And we need to think of it as family, like we can disagree, but we've got each other's back. And that kind of shift of attitude, if you will, is what the work all of us do in our various ways. And I just so appreciate all of you and participating with Bridge Alliance's members and individuals, and spending the time. We've spent literally years getting to know each other. So.
I love the dignity frame. That's great, Debilyn.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's profound and well put. And that leads me into the last question I wanted to ask, which is a bit of a mirror from the first one. It's about the critique that we often get from the left. And I often get from some of my progressive friends and folks I've worked with before. And they'll essentially say something along the lines of, okay, it's all well and good to humanize one another. But, at this moment in time, you have to draw a line in the sand. And there are certain instances in which bringing folks into the same room, even if it's not intended, can practically legitimize bigotry, or do, what folks will call both sidesism. And there was a writer named Julie Kohler who I think persuasively voiced this critique in the Washington Post, and John and I actually had her on the podcast. The name of her piece was "How Calls to Love Your Enemies Enforce the Status Quo." And basically she wrote, "Love politics has a genuine appeal. Who among us could possibly argue that American politics is working or is not suffused with vitriol? Who among us doesn't want love? But like love itself, love politics is complicated. When cleaved from deeper values like truth and justice, and from an honest historical reckoning, love falls short. It flattens anger. In their sincere belief that calmer conversations will heal our dysfunctional political system, advocates of a gentler approach to political disputation can end up framing all anger as equally unjustifiably, equally counterproductive. But righteous anger in response to injustice is not the same as the oppressive anger that fuels it." So I wanted to get y'all's thoughts on that. And maybe I'll start with you, Debilyn, just given where you come from ideologically and your background as a progressive, because I imagine that you all have faced that critique as well.
First of all, I'm not a progressive. I am an independent.
Forgive me.
Grew up with a traditionally conservative and libertarian one family and another family that was very progressive. And I've been on this bridge in between ever since. I call it family therapy. But to your point about the righteous anger, I'm reminded of Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail, where he talked about getting jazz hands from Liz, where he really talked about, peace can be the presence of justice, or peace can be the absence of tension. And too often people who are fighting, and he was naming the white moderates specifically as wanting the absence of tension, the peace of the absence of tension, rather than the presence of justice. And I have gotten really clear. I started out as one of those people, by the way, looking for the absence of tension. I grew up in my conservative mother was very conflict avoidant. She still is. And I have had to learn how to manage my own discomfort so the presence of justice can take hold. We're not there yet in our culture. And so I'm really clear for myself and for the work that we're doing that we're not about the absence of tension, which is the piece that woman was writing about. I am for the presence of justice, and we're going to have to be uncomfortable for a good while in dealing with this current uprising of white supremacy in this moment, because there's always a backlash. Anytime there's an advance, there's a backlash of white supremacy. And I am dedicated to being in the presence of justice to make sure that it does not, the white supremacy will not win now, period.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate your point, Debilyn, and I also appreciate your focus on the dignity, on applying dignity, and just extending a conviction that everybody who enters into this conversation, whether white or black or from the left or the right, is entitled to a certain dignity, right? And that was at the core of Dr. King's nonviolent teaching to begin with. He talked about the importance about this idea of thou-ness, right? That in our social interactions with each other, we see the innate human worth, even past not just disagreement, but even in the hearts of people who we may feel are actually oppressing us in a certain social context. It doesn't matter. We still need to see the human center of that individual, right? So, it's been a fascinating thing to see a movement kind of rise out from this space, you guys, because we are not necessarily like uniform, pursuing a certain policy outcome. What we're pursuing is kind of a way of life in American society, kind of a transformation of our culture by which we extend this thou-ness and this dignity to everybody, and therefore create the space for that positive peace that you were describing, Debilyn, to take root. And so, for me, that's the beloved community that Dr. King talked about. For us, at Braver Angels, that is the idea of a more perfect union, because it's our long-term ability to be able to live together, I think, which answers the question of whether or not the American experiment is actually going to be able to endure. So we're in our final moments here. I'd like to just swing around to each of you really quick and just ask you, at this moment in time, we know that the work is going to get more difficult, and yet people are coming to all of us, from all across the nation, from every walk of life, to be involved ultimately in this kind of work. I want to know what motivates you guys in this moment in time, and what your hopes are for the rest of this season of our enterprises as we go forward. What are you looking forward to accomplishing in this period of time? Starting with you, Liz.
I think we're entering a time when it is imminently obvious to the entire planet that we have work to do here. And I don't, as someone who does love this country and who loves it dearly through the challenges we've had and the things that we need to take care of in bending the arc of justice, I believe that we have a lot of practice at finding a way to get on the other side of a crisis like we're in now. And so I guess I welcome almost by the day, you see more people entering this space and more hearts here. And I look forward to what we can accomplish together, in that gathering. And And I guess I'm pretty optimistic that we'll get there, although it has really been challenging. And I think that there is no more important work, because this is the work that prevents all the other work. And I believe the world is coming around to seeing it that way.
Hear, hear. Pearce, what inspires you in this moment? What are your goals and hopes for National Conversations Project and this movement in the months ahead?
Yeah, some of us, especially now, are leaning on, scripture and a higher power. And there's a Bible verse that I came across, a few weeks back that's been giving me a lot of hope. It's from Isaiah, and it says, "I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." For me, that verse has been speaking to the redeeming possibility through this pain. And as my weaving community partner, David Brooks, has said, we're in a valley now. It's an opportunity for a new birth. So together, as Liz said, I think more and more of us are having that moment where we see that something has to change at the cultural level, at the interrelational level. So as more people see the need for the work, my hope is that all of us will together help create those rivers in the desert and catalyze that new birth for the neighbors and nation. And I do think it starts with coming together, especially with people with whom we wouldn't naturally, with whom are not, near to us, whether it be ideological in terms of background or in terms of proximity, and granting them that dignity and granting them that grace, because indeed we are in this country together. And the only way this experiment succeeds is if we push it to that brighter future together.
Thank you for that, Pearce. And Debilyn, ending now with you. What's inspiring you at the moment, and what are you hoping for out of this time?
Everything that Pearce and Liz said, as far as there is such an immense upwelling of people coming forward right now to do something. And whether it's the, our common purpose report that was just released, that they're to report, whether it's the Braver Angels and everybody being able to shift online, seeing the members of Bridge Alliance that work together through some collaborative granting that we did 3 years ago, having those coalitions now coalesce and advance farther. That is all really inspiring to me, because I know there's dark times ahead, that it's going to get worse before it gets better, more than likely. And because of my strong belief in us and in each other and the American people as a whole, regardless of what it looks like right now, I actually have tremendous faith in the American spirit for us to come together and create the next social contract and the future that we want to live into. And that's where I'm inspired.
Indeed. Well, yeah, that's a forward-looking vision, to be sure. And so, guys, Liz, Pearce, Debilyn, Ciaran, I'm glad that we could have this conversation. And I think it's going to be a remarkable thing, even though things are going to get more challenging in many respects. We know that. But I think we're also going to be able to look back on what we're doing here from, months and years in the future and see that, this was laying the foundation for a real transformation in the hearts of Americans and in the way that we come together, the way that we choose to come together to do politics in this country. So let's believe in that future, and let's make it happen, folks. So,
Hear, hear.
Amen.
Indeed. Thank you all so much for folks listening. You will hear from Pearce, Liz, and Debilyn again. In the meantime, if you support this work, join us. Join us as a member at braverangels.org. Like, share, and subscribe to this podcast. And tune in again next time. We are building a house united. Until then.